For many years, people thought that Erik Estrada and Larry Wilcox had the same relationship off-screen that they did on TV. When Wilcox eventually speaks at the age of 78, however, the audience isn't prepared for the reality. Why did he have to wait so long? Was the turning point a near-fatal motorcycle accident? Today, we expose the egos, legal actions, and startling actions that drove him away, as well as the forgiveness that ultimately put an end to their conflict. Performance or chemistry? Frank Poncherello and John Baker were the quintessential California couple on television. Easygoing, endearing, and incredibly likable. Every week, Chip fans tuned in to witness Larry Wilcox and Erik Estrada joke around while navigating rescues, fast-paced pursuits, and sunny adventures. Viewers felt the chemistry must be genuine because it seemed so natural. Now, however, Wilcox discloses something that few could have predicted. Instead of a portrayal of genuine relationship, viewers witnessed the strength of professionalism. A developing tension off camera was frequently concealed by the grins on camera. Wilcox anticipated a conflict from the start. He says his initial reaction to Estrada was nearly overwhelming. Mirrors, swagger, and constant priming. As well as persistent attention-seeking. Constantly aware of his image, hair, and makeup, the young celebrity strolled in and out of the set. Wilcox remembers that Estrada added to the atmosphere of unbridled ego by constantly making advances on women and occasionally inviting them to his trailer. Wilcox found it shocking. He acknowledges that he believed he was working with the most conceited man he had ever encountered. It was a culture shock for a Marine veteran accustomed to discipline and modesty. However, Wilcox was also aware of the guidelines for surviving in Hollywood. He reminded himself that the series wasn't about him. It was about the group, the team, and the audience, who anticipated easy friendship. Thus, he decided to persevere. Personal annoyances would not stop him from doing his job. He created a code for himself. To prevent dwelling on resentment. Perhaps he is to blame. Perhaps, he thought, it was mine. In any case, avoid getting lost in it. He was able to film for 5 seasons because to such mentality. Few fans ever witnessed something like this endurance. How much of the chemistry in Hollywood is fake? Despite scarcely tolerating one another behind the scenes, the two men were able to convey charm and rhythm on screen. That is the hallmark of talented actors who can make fiction seem real. Wilcox now acknowledges that their renowned friendship was actually a truce masquerading as friendship for extended periods of time. Audiences never suspected a rift since it was so convincingly portrayed for the camera. While the actors gritted their teeth and completed the task, viewers projected their own dreams onto the pair. Here, 3 things are noteworthy. First, even when there is a lot of tension off-screen, chemistry can still be developed on-screen. Another professional skill is endurance. Wilcox maintained the series' plausibility by separating the personal from the professional. Third, the lens affects perception. Warmth was seen by fans. Wilcox saw poisoning. Neither was entirely incorrect. It just relied on your position. Wilcox's memories highlight the unspoken price of maintaining appearances. He was required to set aside his displeasure and exhibit the kind of playful camaraderie that made Chips a cultural icon week after week. But behind the scenes, he was burdened with annoyance and bitterness. He bottled it up since he couldn't confront Estrada without running the danger of explosions on set or in the media. The show had years of popularity as a result of that decision. However, it also created pressure that would eventually surface. However, nothing could sustain the facade indefinitely. The balance of power on site was permanently altered by a single stunt gone wrong and an accident that almost claimed Estrada's life. An uncomfortable truce quickly turned into something far more risky for Wilcox's career as well as Estrada's health. The cooperation was put to the test on the day a motorcycle flipped through the air. Blood, litigation, and leverage rewrote it. Math was altered by the crash. The sound of engines roaring and the painful twist of a stunt gone wrong marked a turning moment. What ought to have been just another typical Chips action scenario descended into chaos. One of the most terrifying kinds of collisions occurred when Erik Estrada's motorcycle plunged into a perilous steep side. He was thrown into a truck after the bike overturned and crashed into him. The set abruptly changed from a Hollywood production to a real-life emergency. As paramedics rushed and crew members panicked, Larry Wilcox, who had served in the Marine Corps, leaped in to provide first aid. The wounds were severe. Doctors feared a torn aorta. Estrada's lungs were full with blood, and his sternum was shattered. At the hospital, he was granted last rites. Everyone was expecting the worst, convinced that he might not make it through the night. After working side by side with him despite their tense relationship, Wilcox found himself in the bizarre situation of saving the man he had endured so much. Ego struggles didn't matter in that moment because he stabilized him and helped keep him alive long enough to be transported. It was a matter of survival. However, there are repercussions for survival, particularly in Hollywood. Despite a drawn-out and agonizing recuperation, Estrada did survive. However, survival also meant leverage. Later, Wilcox acknowledges he never knew for sure whether the motorcycle accident was manufactured or real, but it afforded Estrada a legal opening. The studio found itself in a tight spot after he filed a lawsuit against MGM and NBC, demanding damages. Producers and networks have to deal with more than simply an actor. They were up against a celebrity who had both power and sympathy on his side. This is where television's icy math enters the picture. For the majority of spectators, Chips was about humor, adventure, and friendship. It was about syndication for the network. 6 seasons were required for a show to be eligible for the lucrative reruns. It was a wonderful run after 5 seasons. Years, even decades, were implied by 6 of revenue coming in. There was no negotiating that 6th season. If it wasn't delivered by NBC and MGM, the investment failed. They were therefore left with little option when Estrada imposed his lawsuit on them and demanded concessions. In addition to his character, he had become essential to the project's overall financial viability. In the center of that equation was Wilcox. He learned how well-liked he was overseas when he went to Brazil on a commercial tour. He was met at the airport in Sao Paulo by 40,000 admirers, many of whom were wearing Mini-Chips uniforms. He was boosted by the admiration of a crowd that demonstrated his worldwide appeal, and for an hour he felt like Elvis. Wilcox would have been unbeatable if the show had been about popularity contests. However, in boardrooms in Los Angeles, leverage was more important than popularity. The news hit him like a sucker punch when he got back. NBC is letting you go, his agent said upon delivering the call. Why? Wilcox had to go, according to one of Estrada's demands. The network felt stuck even if they detested the choice. There wouldn't have been a 6th season, syndication, or return on investment without Estrada. There was hope with him, but only if Wilcox was given up. It was a clean calculation from a business standpoint. It was heartbreaking on a human level. This chapter highlights 3 facts. First, of all, mishaps aren't limited to Hollywood mishaps. They alter power, contracts, and careers. Second, when corporate math takes over, fan loyalty is insufficient to keep you safe. Third, the logic of leverage can negate even life-saving actions. 5 years after he had practically helped keep Estrada alive, Wilcox was let go at his request. It was cruelly ironic. This was more than just a dismissal for Wilcox. A warning that friendships and even bravery may be overshadowed by spreadsheet statistics in the entertainment industry. It was a betrayal disguised in business jargon. For him personally, it also signaled the start of a new downward spiral. After enduring 5 years of stress, he found that his fortitude had not guaranteed his position. It had prepared him for expulsion. There was bloodshed, terror, and frantic medical attention during the collision. Its aftermath, however, was entirely economic. Studios made a difficult choice when comparing Wilcox to syndication. He was the price of the sacrifice that the math required. Wilcox would not go quietly, no matter how outrageous it was. He wrote his own exit headline before anybody else could, instead, launching a daring counterplay. He thus penned the headline. Although Larry Wilcox had experienced many pranks, nothing had prepared him for the blow that greeted him upon his return from Brazil. He had just returned from a trip in which 40,000 people gathered around him like a rock star at the airport. His every action was monitored by the Brazilian press. The kids were dressed in Chip's uniforms. And Wilcox felt untouchable for a time. But things were ruthlessly different back home. "NBC is letting you go," his agent informed him over the phone, shocking him. The words struck more forcefully than any collision. Wilcox left the show after years of keeping it together and saving Estrada's life on the asphalt. Even worse, Estrada had made the demand himself. The majority of actors would have become silent or indignant. On the other hand, Wilcox had a business-minded side. He was aware that the story was as crucial in Hollywood as the deal. He would be labeled as damaged goods if news spread that he had been fired, and no studio wanted to deal with that liability. He took action first rather than waiting for the news to go out. He called his lawyer, Martin Letitz, his team, Rogers and Cowan, a reputable journalist from the Los Angeles Times, and his well-known public relations business. It was a straightforward but bold plan. The world would assume it was his decision if NBC wanted him gone. One of Wilcox's favorite locations, a well-known French restaurant in the Valley, served as the venue for the meeting. He outlined the story during lunch. He wasn't a wasted celebrity. He was a man who was exploring new places and making his own decisions. The author's quotes were incisive enough to break through the clutter. It was evident from those lines that Wilcox was not licking wounds. He was entering the second act. The headline accurately conveyed the story when the article was published. Larry Wilcox has made the decision to depart from Chips. It appeared to the public that he had left with assurance. The facade of self-determination concealed the pain of being ejected. This move demonstrates how important image control is in the film industry. Wilcox recognized three realities. First, there is no dignity. It's well made. An article in the right spot can shield a person's reputation for years. Second, PR isn't nonsense. It is a matter of survival. Managing your story is crucial in a field that depends heavily on perception. Third, you retain control if you don't accept victimization. Yes, he had been caught off guard, but he didn't want to appear weak. Rather, he presented himself as the decision maker. However, the rage persisted behind the scenes. He acknowledges that his small-town, punk side, which believed in settling scores under the barn, desired retribution. He had fantasies about going up against Estrada. About letting go of years' worth of pent-up resentment. However, he was aware that path would ruin him more quickly than any studio could. It would have been wiser to direct the energy into something positive. Wilcox hurried. Wilcox was already working on his next act as Estrada remained with Chips. He demonstrated that he was more than just an actor by producing Ray Bradbury Theater for 5 years all over the world. He purchased the rights to Dorothy Stratton's terrible narrative, Death of a Playmate, and turned it into a well-known project. While others slept, he was proposing shows, developing screenplays, and making deals. He changed from being an employee to an entrepreneur. He wasn't only getting by. He was changing who he was. Nevertheless, the wound persisted even as he forged new routes. For many years, he thought the public accepted his version of events, that he had made the decision to go. However, the confirmation that followed rekindled the old flame. One day he was sitting across from a producer named Cy Skirak, who stated, "Larry, I was in the room when Estrada had you fired." It was like ripping the scab off to hear it said so plainly. Abandonment and betrayal struck again. It was fact, not merely a hearsay. This section of Wilcox's tale emphasizes a challenging lesson. In Hollywood, appearances are just as important as skill. Even though you may be well liked in Brazil, respected by critics, and appreciated by fans, you are disposable if the studio math demands it. The tale you leave behind is the only thing you can control. And that is precisely what Wilcox did. Even though he was ejected, he left on his own terms in the eyes of the public and the media. Controlling the story, however, did not make the resentment go away. Wilcox held the resentment like a burden for 5 long years until a sudden choice turned his conflict into forgiveness. Anger for 5 years. Through interviews, Larry Wilcox was able to smile, manipulate the press, and revive his career. However, there was another truth that surfaced after the cameras were turned off. He was upset. No essay could adequately describe the depth of the betrayal sting. He and Estrada had not just argued on set. A producer confirmed that he had actively lobbied for Wilcox's dismissal. After years of putting up with the posturing, the ego, and the swagger. After saving Estrada's life in a collision, Wilcox was dismissed. It takes time for that type of wound to heal. That weight weighed on Wilcox for 5 years. He acknowledges that there were evenings when his inner redneck wanted nothing more than to resolve disputes man-to-man, behind the barn. He dreamed of demonstrating to Estrada what it meant to be disloyal to someone who took great satisfaction in discipline and fidelity. Even in those instances, though, he was restrained by another voice. The sensible businessman who realized that route would only lead to disaster. Anger doesn't create a future, but it may keep you going for a night. Knowing that didn't make it go away, though. In actuality, rage turned become a habit. According to Wilcox, it nourished itself. One nighttime drink became another. The topic of the treachery came up again. Anger became a constant companion, a silent reminder of unfairness. He might put it under his hat and work on film projects, chasing new agreements, or presenting Ray Bradbury theater. However, the resentment returned when the phones ceased to ring and the rooms became silent. The heart was trapped, yet the career was progressing. From this stage of his life, 3 things can be learned. To begin with, resentment is alluring. Makes you feel powerful at the time, but it gradually wears you down. Second, healing is not the same as endurance. He had worked with Estrada for 5 years, but perseverance after betrayal just served to exacerbate the pain. Third, even after the other person has moved on, anger is a prison that you keep yourself in. The pivotal moment occurred when Wilcox posed a harsh question to himself. Will you always wriggle in your retaliation? He became aware that he was not being satisfied by his fury. It wasn't making his life more fulfilling or improving his quality of sleep. Rather, it was binding him to an unchangeable history. The boardroom agreement that had terminated his tenure on Chips could not be rewritten with any amount of resentment. Finding a way out or remaining in the cage was the only option left. Thus, he took a decision that few would have predicted. He would fall in love with this guy rather than escalating the conflict. He wouldn't manipulate or pretend. It has to be authentic. Wilcox would take a back seat if Estrada want the limelight at gatherings. Wilcox would gladly refer admirers to Punch if they wanted photos with him. Wilcox would comply and encourage Estrada to overshadow him in interviews. He consciously eschewed competition in favor of humility. It appeared to be capitulation to some. It was freedom to Wilcox. The outcomes were unexpected. He felt lighter the more he embraced this way of thinking. It no longer hurt to help Estrada. In fact, it released him from the clutches of bitterness. At conventions, he discovered that he was laughing once more and relishing the enthusiasm of fans without the previous resentment. He regained emotional control by deciding to disarm the feud. He was no longer owned by the feud. He had forgotten about it. To forgive was not to forget. The treachery was still fresh in his mind. He could still feel the agony of being evicted. However, those recollections were no longer poisonous. They weren't the definition of his story, they were a part of it. And by removing the influence of bitterness, Wilcox discovered serenity, which was superior to validation. However, peace only arrived once Wilcox changed his viewpoint and began to see Erik as the man who had been molded by a more brutal history rather than as the opponent who had betrayed him. Seeing Erik, not Estrada. Sometimes you have to look past what someone did and try to understand why in order to forgive them. That change for Larry Wilcox occurred when he began dating Erik, the man from Harlem, instead of Erik Estrada, the Peacock star. Wilcox started looking at his former co-star from a new perspective, one influenced by survival, adversity, and upbringing. Estrada hadn't had the luxury of easy loyalty, stability, or trust as a child. He was raised in a difficult neighborhood, in a shattered home, and in a culture where pursuing goals was more important for survival than pride. From that vantage point, Estrada's actions appeared different. What Wilcox originally perceived as arrogance, the mirror checks, the strutting, the continual attention-seeking, now appeared more like armor. Appearances were a guarantee of safety in Hollywood. Estrada saw every joke, brag, and smile as a means of fortifying himself against a society that had taught him to have no faith in anyone. Wilcox saw that Estrada's drive was more about securing his position in a competitive industry and demonstrating to himself and others that he belonged than it was about ego. Empathy was made possible by this reinterpretation. First, in the storm that shaped them, everyone's actions make sense. Speaking to point 2, personal dread is frequently concealed by professional competitiveness. Speaking to point 3, compassion explains betrayal but does not justify it. Wilcox told himself that Estrada was not making personal jabs at him. He was struggling to stay alive as the series' main character. And Wilcox had turned into a barrier in that battle. You don't feel sorry for hurdles while you're trying to reach the summit. They are pushed aside. Wilcox's burden changed as he came to terms with that. He stopped seeing Estrada's actions to be personal jabs. He viewed them as survival strategies from a man who had a different starting line instead. That insight lessened the pain of the past, but it did not remove it. He even regained his appreciation for Estrada as a performer rather than as an adversary. According to Wilcox, he is an entertainer who enjoys entertaining. Estrada's exaggerated antics were no longer bothersome from that perspective. They were simply a component of his identity. This shift manifested itself in real-world ways. Wilcox was kind when he appeared in public and at fan conventions. Wilcox didn't resist when the spotlight swung toward Estrada. He was glad of it. Wilcox directed people toward Punch if they wanted it on their pictures. Wilcox allowed Estrada to shine if reporters concentrated on his personality. He found that he was not diminished by giving Estrada the stage. It freed him. Wilcox found peace in letting go of the competition. The amazing thing is that this was not a phony act of forgiveness. Manipulation to please the media or win back fans wasn't the goal. It was authentic. Wilcox had made the decision that resentment was no longer worthwhile. And after he made that decision, his actions were a logical progression. Estrada didn't have to apologize to him anymore. He was no longer in need of approval. By refusing to let past traumas to define him, he had already regained control. And now for the surprising turn. In the end, Wilcox gained more from forgiveness than Estrada did. The resentment had kept him bound to the past, like a burden on his chest. His life became lighter after he let it go. Fan events could be enjoyable for him. Giggle at old tales and remember chips without the bitterness of betrayal obscuring his thoughts. He could now look back on the same collaboration that had once made him angry with appreciation for the lessons it had taught him. Estrada remained the same. Wilcox had. And that shift made it possible for him to proceed in peace and dignity. He changed from being the actor who carried a feud for decades to finally letting it go. What prompted Larry Wilcox to finally share his side of the tale at the age of 78 after decades of silence? What's he talking about at 78? Larry Wilcox remained silent for decades. Rumors circulated, journalists made insinuations, and fans conjectured. However, he never took the time to speak candidly about his years on Chips. He encouraged viewers to cling to the idea of an unbreakable friendship by letting the reruns play and letting the nostalgia flow. However, Wilcox has decided to speak now at the age of 78. Why now? Time, perspective, and the freedom that comes with not having to preserve an image are the answers. As you enter later stages of life, your perspective on the world changes. Wilcox claims that becoming older gave him a certain insight that he was unable to have in a crisis. Emotions were raw back then. Angry feelings impaired judgment. Honesty was risky because of pride. But now that decades have passed, he can finally distinguish between what was important and what wasn't. He no longer needs retribution, and he no longer needs to vie with Estrada for attention. His legacy is already written at the age of 78. It's not about settling scores when we speak. It has to do with keeping records. Wilcox picked this particular moment for three main reasons. Timing as mercy comes first. He could use his words as teaching tools rather than weapons if he waited until the drama had subsided. The feud would have turned into a tabloid battle if he had spoken up in the 1980s. He makes sure the story is viewed with contemplation rather than indignation by being silent at the time and speaking now. Secondly, fans need clarity. People thought the smiles represented friendship for years. Wilcox wants the audience to know the truth. To show them respect by revealing the truth, but not to ruin their passion for the show. Third, advice for aspiring actors. He is aware that the same difficulties, ego conflicts, studio politics, and contract disputes will be faced by future generations. His narrative serves as a guide for getting through it without allowing resentment to define you. Peace is a more straightforward explanation. Being silent can weigh as much as being angry. The story persisted in Wilcox's mind even after he learned to forgive. He lets go of the last burden by telling it now. The goal is not to disparage Estrada. He makes a special effort to recognize Estrada's skill, charm, and passion for performing. It's about honestly ending his own chapter. Demystifying the industry is another goal of his. Hollywood frequently appears glitzy and carefree to viewers, but Wilcox is aware of this. He experienced the politics of syndication math, where millions of dollars may be decided by a single season. He experienced firsthand how contracts, not friendship, determine who remains and who leaves. Not to ruin the reminiscence, but to reveal that truth, he shares his narrative. But to assist viewers in comprehending what actually occurs behind the glitzy posters. The tone that Wilcox currently employs is maybe the most striking. He is not filled with resentment. He doesn't disrespect people. Rather, his tone is one of serene acceptance. He can acknowledge that Estrada harmed him, but he can also acknowledge that his own difficult history influenced Estrada's need for fame. Only time can provide that balance, the capacity to contain truth without venom. Wilcox has it, and it's evident at 78. Why now, then? Sincerity no longer jeopardizes his prospects at this point. It keeps his legacy intact. Additionally, Wilcox wants to impart to his fans, peers, and aspiring actors the lesson he learned the hard way, that peace is more important than pride after years of keeping the story under wraps. And the last thing Wilcox wants the world to remember is that lesson, one that was difficult to learn, expensive, and liberating. He wants everyone to remember the lesson. Larry Wilcox wants his story to conclude with more than just another Hollywood feud after all the stunts, accidents, betrayals, and years of silence. He doesn't want to be known as the actor who left Chips at its heyday or as the guy who got into a fight with Erik Estrada. He wants a much more profound lesson to be learned. That what other people did to you doesn't define your legacy, but by the way you decide to react. Estrada served as both a teacher and an adversary in his narrative. Wilcox acknowledges that he might not have learned about his own forbearance, commercial acumen, or tenacity if it weren't for such confrontations. Despite the pain, the struggle made him mature. That's his lesson's initial section. You are sometimes most shaped by the individuals that irritate you the most. In an odd way, he once saved Estrada's life on the asphalt. Additionally, Estrada offered him a new form of existence that required development, foresight, and fortitude. The lesson's second section focuses on letting go. Wilcox wore his rage like a medal for years. It strengthened him, he believed. It bound him to the past instead. He didn't find true strength until he chose to forgive, not because Estrada expressed regret, but because Wilcox himself desired freedom. Will you always wriggle in your retaliation? What, he asked himself. Letting go wasn't losing, he understood, so the answer had to be no. He was regaining his tranquility. The lesson's third section discusses legacy in general. Wilcox, 78, is aware that his followers will always think of him as John Baker, the tan, steady police officer who rode with punch. And that's fine with him. However, he also wants them to remember the Marine, producer, hustler, and above all, someone who discovered how to put compassion before resentment. He believes that decision is more important than any competition for viewers or syndication agreement. Wilcox highlights that the events on Chips are only one illustration of a universal truth. You will encounter unfair decisions, ego conflicts, and treachery in any relationship or career. That is beyond your control. Whether or not you allow it to engulf you is within your control. You wind up living in a jail that you created for yourself if you harbor all your grievances. However, you find a freedom that no one can take away if you learn to let it go. He provides that pattern to anyone who is mired in hatred, not just performers. How do you feel with Larry Wilcox's choice to finally speak up? Has it altered your perception of Chips and the collaboration that made it possible? Your opinions would be greatly appreciated. In the comments section below, please share them. Please remember to use the like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring the bell if you like this in-depth look at a timeless TV reality. This way, you won't miss another story. And click the video on your screen right now if you're prepared for additional behind-the-scenes disclosures. We have yet another Hollywood secret in store for you.